Greetings, and welcome to Beatles Stuffology, where two old friends sit about and talk BS, Beatles stuff, on a track-by-track basis, pretty much for the sake of it. My name is McQuarrie, and I'm here with my co-host, Andrew Deacon. Say hi, Andrew.
Hello, how are you?
Yes, I'm doing all right, thank you. How are you?
Just all right?
Just all right. Yeah, struggling through dealing with the ins and outs and the ups and downs of life in general. What about yourself?
I'm okay. I'm okay. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'd go as far to say if you've listened to the previous episode, I'm on the mend. Because if you managed to get through the whole of that episode, you'll realise that it perhaps wasn't our most cheerful and uplifting of recordings. But then, dear listener, it's probably fair to say that both of us were in what's the expression our parents probably would have used? Wars. Um, slightly odd expression. But yeah, when recording that, JG was incapacitated with a slashed hand and a fractured elbow or something like that.
That's it.
And I had pulmonary embolism from which I'm on the road to recovery. So yeah, that was difficult recording, and perhaps if it had been a slightly better song, we might have been able to work through it. But I think people will acknowledge the fact that that almost gave our lives to the to our art. It probably wasn't for the greatest of songs, let alone podcasts. But you know, the weather is fantastic today. We're on day 2 so far. It's going pretty well for England, and for our majority American listenership, I'm not going to translate that last sentence. Suffice to say that actually, do you know what? The world's not too bad a place at the moment. The world's a pretty horrible place, but my individual world is looking a lot better than it was a couple of weeks ago.
Well, that's not too bad then. As long as we can both claim that we're traveling in the right direction, then we are doing all right. So, well, this week we have a twofer. We are going to be discussing the album, A Hard Day's Night, as a complete piece rather than as a series of individual songs. And we are also going to be discussing the movie. But we're going to start with the album because I'm going to tenuously claim that's a link.
Well, in fact, let's not even start with the album because we've given personal news, but of course, what we really should do as a Beatles podcast, one of the 54 podcasts, is delve into some of the latest Beatles news. And the thing that never ceases to amaze me is that there's always a latest piece of Beatles news. Now, some of this has come out because a certain Mr. McCartney is promoting his photographs from 1964, previously unseen photographs. And in an interview with the BBC earlier this week, he disclosed the existence, he'd actually disclosed this before, but never mind, the existence of a track, which seems to have been gripping Beatles Twitter with excitement and or torpor, depending on your point of view. But it seems, looking at a clip from around the time of Free as a Bird and the other one, oh, Real Love, that they actually were working on this other track. It's Now and Then, I think, but that George went off it, so that they then put the whole inside. But it looks like now, with the magic of the technology that was used on Get Back, they've been able to clean up John Lennon's vocal considerably by separating it out from everything else, and as a result, presumably, and Starr have been working on instrumentation to go with it. So we shall see. What I don't yet know is whether or not a certain Mr. Lynn, who's now been inducted into the Spotify songwriting team, is also going to be involved, which would certainly cloud my judgment of it. But yeah, interesting news, I thought. What did you think?
I think it's interesting news too. Of course I do. It's a potential new Beatles song. Sort of, kind of. I don't know. I think it's interesting that they're going back to it and trying to complete, the third song that they were working on around the time of Anthology. There seems to have been a lot of obfuscation as to why George wasn't that keen on the song. And it's not really clear, I don't think, whether he just thought it was a bad song or whether he just thought the quality of the recording wasn't good enough to justify it in terms. I mean, it's not like the quality of the vocal in Real Love was, astoundingly high fidelity either. But, it seems to be an open question why, after an afternoon's work on it, he just went, nah, don't think so. And also a lot of speculation along the lines of, well, he's dead now, he doesn't get a vote. So it's interesting. There's a lot of hysteria around like the idea of the fact that it's AI which is being used in order to kind of put this stuff together.
I deliberately avoided using that as a term because it's not really AI in the sense that understand it at the moment, is it?
No, it's not. And like so much like generative content which is created by AI is, it's things like, oh, like Freddie Mercury at the 2023 Pride event or whatever. It's not that. It's basically using artificial intelligence to be a step up from sort of Pro Tools or Logic. It's using it as a production technique, not to actually generate like original content. There's been a bunch of stuff of like, what if the Beatles had recorded a song by the Monkees or by the Rolling Stones or stuff like that, and that's a very different order of magnitude of AI kind of implementation. This is just basically using it as a production technique, so that's fine. I really don't have any big issue with the fact that they're using AI for that side of things. What will be interesting to see is whether George Harrison is actually going to be on this or not.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously he wasn't on Lennon's original demo, which I think dates from 1978, and obviously McCartney and Starr can be on it. So the question is George going to be on it? I don't know if he ever recorded anything when they were trying to work on it back at the anthology sessions. It could be that he did, and then that can now be integrated as well. But I really don't know, and I haven't seen anything in the reports I've read to kind of cover that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those. It's an interesting thing. It's a curio, but I do find it hard to get too invested. And
Yes.
buying, well, watching and then buying the soundtrack to the 1988 Lennon documentary the Yoko Ono commissioned, Imagine, and Real Love was on the sound. And so actually then, you know, it was a little bit surprising 7 or 8 years later when I wasn't really that invested in the Beatles at that point to hear that Free as a Bird and then this aware of had been released as Beatles singles. You know, it's fine. It's a song that might involve the Beatles, but it doesn't make it a Beatles song. And even if certainly, you know, history would sort of dictate that bands that get back together again after a long period of time, that it's very rare that the work is better than the original context they were in, with the original passion and drive that they had. So I think fine. It's nice to have something they've worked on, but without the context of the band and all of that entails, it's a curiosity. And I'm much more interested in hearing the Stowe School live recordings, actually. I'm much more interested in hearing the you know, bootlegs of some of those concerts, and things that we've not really heard before than I am in listening to this. You know, it's great that there's the technology. It's interesting to visit earlier work, and potentially improve, develop flawed pieces, but I don't know, it's not a real thing. So you know, enjoy it, people. I suspect there'll be some who will claim it's great, it's amazing, and there'll be some who will see it as a disappointment. And there'll probably be a whole bunch of people in between who will go, okay, move on.
Yep, and I think that's pretty much the category I'm going to fall into. It'll be a curate's egg, but that's fine. Also, I find it hard to qualify anything that was recorded in 1978 as a Beatles song. It's not. If it had been something that was unreleased from the White Album sessions or from the Get Back sessions, that then they had subsequently gone back and worked on, I would have no problem saying, yeah, that's a Beatles song, but it's not. It's a John Lennon demo that a bunch of other people have recorded some stuff over. Okay, they may be the same people that were in the band, but that's not quite the same thing either. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to hear, but as much as anything else, I think it will be a proving shop for technology. Yeah, that's about where I stand on it. And with that, I think we can probably toddle our way along to something which definitely is Beatles content. Oh, those smooth links just keep on coming. And that would be their very first movie and their very first, technically, a soundtrack. So, A Hard Day's Night. Let's get cracking on it. So, we've done all the songs individually. And I already disagree with some of my ratings going back and listening to the actual album as a complete piece of work. We'll get to that. But what are your thoughts on it as an album?
Well, I think one of the incredible things is it's that they've released in about 15, 16 months. And of course, it's an album that doesn't have covers. And I think you put those two things together and you get something quite amazing, especially bearing in mind that into the 70s and beyond, it became increasingly rare that bands would put out an album every 3 years sometimes, let alone every 2 years. So the amount of work that they're producing in a short period of time is amazing. And bearing in mind, as we've discussed in the various episodes, how little time there is between the writing, the rehearsing, and the recording of these songs. So what they're doing is particularly remarkable. I think it's all the more remarkable if you bear in mind that still the album charts are not a massive thing. The singles chart is still where everybody else is focused. And if you kind of look around at some of the in 1964 that we might as being big acts in the 60s, like the Stones, Dave Clark 5, Manfred Mann, the Kinks and the Animals, well, they all had albums in the top 10 in 19. But of those, Dave Clark 5 and the Kinks had the most self-penned songs. So Dave Clark 5 was about 3/4, the Kinks it was about a third. So there is something really remarkable in terms of what the Beatles are doing. All the more so seeing how much they have pushed everything else on. You sort of have a look at some of the album covers for these other ones, and they're quite generic. Some of the album titles themselves are quite generic. You've got A Session with the Stay with the Hollies, The 5 Faces of Manfred Mann, and then the other 3 are just eponymous titles. Whereas here you've got something that, admittedly is a song title, but it's vastly different from any of these other generic ones. So, whatever you feel about the individual collections of songs and how they're put together, what they're doing is culturally significant, even if perhaps people didn't realize just how culturally it was at the time. It's an amazing breakthrough. I mean, some big recording acts aren't even having albums released in 1964. So, Billy J. Kramer had a #1 hit in 1964, but no UK album. Jerry and the top 10 hits, but no 1964 album. Cilla Black had 2 #1 singles, but doesn't have an album until 1965. So it's still something that is perhaps not the exception, but perhaps not as common. The record companies aren't sure that they're actually going to make some money out of it.
I think one of the most amazing things about A Hard Day's Night, particularly compared to With the Beatles and Please Please Me, is just how modern it feels. It really feels like a complete album. Now, some of that is going to be the writing. Some of it will be the sense that, there's going to be that consistency because it's just Lennon McCartney songs on it. But even so, it feels like such a big leap forward. Like With the Beatles definitely feels like a move on from Please Please Me. That's not to denigrate Please Please Me particularly. I think it's probably the best possible album they could have done in 1963 at that point. But the gap between With the Beatles and A Hard Day's Night is so much wider than between Please Please Me and With the Beatles. And it has a real sense of it being what we would understand as a modern album, i.e., there is some kind of unification to it. It doesn't need to be, obviously it's not a concept album or anything like that, but there's a unity of tone, there's a unity of style, there's a unity in terms of the way that it's put together, the way it's constructed, and that makes it feel incredibly modern. Even now, it has that real sense of a bunch of people who are working to create something which is like, I don't want to say artistic vision, that's far too pretentious, but they are working to produce something which is a whole piece of work. And that's even more remarkable given that half of it's a soundtrack and half of it are songs which are there to, just flesh out the album. But maybe that is also part of it. It's that idea that of, an album having two sides. The first side is a soundtrack, and it's incredibly tight and well put together, even with the slightly dour I'm happy just to dance with you, which is probably the weak link in side one. But even so, like, in context, it works incredibly well. Side two works incredibly well as its own piece as well, slightly distinct from the songs which actually end up in the movie, but nevertheless they still have their own whole because they're being written for a specific purpose, which is side two. It's the B-side of the album, and all those songs are there to kind of fill that out, and it just all works. I think it's an amazing piece, and honestly, I haven't given that much time to Hard Day's Night as an album, truth be told, but going back and revisiting it in this way, I'm startled by how contemporary and how modern it seems.
I mean, you almost need to divide some of the songs that were written specifically for a possible soundtrack album, and some of those that were written and recorded in June '64 in order to fill the album up, which is pretty much what side B is. Although one of the notable exceptions to that is You Can't Do That, which was originally recorded in the film but got dropped. So there is a sense that, and I think there was there was another one as well. I can't remember what it was, but there was the song that was originally going to be the sequence. Forgotten it for now, but that's okay. Well, that may well come back to me at some point. But most of them were written later than the others, so they have a slightly different feel. I think there is a bit more of a downbeat feel to, as opposed to some of the more uplifting lyrics. And whether that's just a case of, we've got to write a bunch of stuff for this film. Isn't it exciting? We're going to write a film, and then, well, we've got the film. We now need to get up 14 tracks because that's what the record company decrees that we have to have. So therefore, let's just write a few more. But either way, it's noticeable that they're pretty much writing things to order. They're not a band who are sitting around going, okay, well, we've written a bunch of songs in the studio. It's a case of, right, well, we have to write some stuff. Let's write it because we've got to, because we're in the studio. So it's an interesting way of working, and bearing all of that in mind, it's of demonstrating that they are capable of working under pressure. And actually, I've heard an assertion recently that because of the way in which the music industry now operates, in the sense that, okay, fair enough, you need to get out there and you need to, but you're not making an awful lot of money off publishing. It almost seems like we've gone back to the situation where bands are releasing new material on a much more regular basis. Perhaps an unintended consequence of the whole Spotify, but it is interesting that bands are having to to recoup more money more regularly, rather than, I think the expression I had was just sitting on their backsides waiting for the royalties to drop in.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think when it comes to Hard Day's Night, I mean, there's the speed at which this flew up the charts was remarkable, but it didn't go in at number one. It went in, I think, at number 3, if I'm not mistaken. And the charts are kind of interesting when it comes to the week that Hard Day's Night went to number 1. It's our brief visit to the charts, but they knocked the Rolling Stones off the number 1 spot. That's fine. Number 3 is Cliff Richard. All right, fair enough. He's going to be a name that we just inescapably can't get away from throughout the course of this podcast when we're looking at the charts. And then the rest of it it's kind of a, I don't know. It's well, number 4 is The Bachelors. Okay. Number five is number five is the soundtrack, West Side Story. Well, okay, fair enough. We know that they're still selling by the shed load. Number six is Elvis. Number seven is the Shadows. Number eight is the Beatles. Nine is Roy Orbison, and 10 is the Searchers. It's another one of those. I think maybe with the exception of the Stones, it's incredibly sort of small C conservative and safe.
Yeah.
There isn't a lot to really challenge the listener there. And I think when it comes to something like Hard Day's Night as an album, I mean, there's so much dynamism. I mean, that Elvis album is kissing cousins. Yeah, good luck finding anyone who cares about that. Right, okay, Rolling Stones. That's fair enough. And the rest of it is it's. I don't want to say it's dross, but I mean also it pretty much is. And it's
Yeah.
one of the reasons that this album kind of again feels very contemporary is because even given the context within which it was released, it's just head and shoulders above anything else. Like that first Rolling Stones album is fine. It's okay. It's kind of primitive. It's not the best thing they're ever going to do, I think it's fair to say, but it's all right. At least it's challenging. At least it's a little bit interesting. Everything else there is just, it's just there. And A Hard Day's Night is so fresh by comparison. So it's very easy to understand just why this album had kind of the impact it did.
I think some of those bands though were on the horns of a dilemma. I mean, first and foremost, I mean, what you're actually saying reinforces my point about the fact that there wasn't a huge amount of variety from what we would regard as the outstanding bands of the generation.
Absolutely.
But if you have a look at there's a really useful Wikipedia page where it lists all of the top 10 albums in 1964, and for a start, a lot of the list is in 1963, but the list itself isn't that huge. So it's not as though the huge church, there are 4, 5, 6 different albums there every week, as perhaps there may be sometimes. You've got a lot of, well, not many albums being released. And as a result, a lot of very average albums sticking around, presumably not selling a massive amount, but getting in there because there isn't a huge amount of competition. So, but what you also get is people on some of those bands on those albums effectively, wearing their influences on their sleeves. So, the Animals, for example, they're doing the Rolling Stones thing of, oh, we're a blues band, let's do loads of really good blues covers, which is fine. There was an audience for that, but then that's not necessarily that dissimilar to how the music industry had been up to that point, where you would have artists who were performing someone else's song, and the skill of the artist and the manager was in selecting the appropriate song that had been written by somebody else, which again is where the Beatles break. There you go. There's one for the bingo. Um, and I think it's just being able to look down the listing and go Lennon McCartney all the way down that makes it so significant. And it thing. It doesn't really matter that George doesn't have a song in it because his writing won't really get particularly strong for a while. Yeah, and it doesn't even really matter that it's a Lennon over, that there are so many more songs that are written by John. It suggests to me that when Paul had an idea, it was a really, really good one. That Lennon had more ideas, not necessarily ones, but he was able to have the force of personality to be able to come up with these ideas in a very short space of time and see them through, perhaps in a way that McCartney developed later on in their career. But it's another one of those things that is a step forward. And I think Bob Stanley sort of talks about the fact that you should be slightly suspicious of those people who say that they can see the link between me and things like Rain. But he does agree that there are sort of steps in the right direction with things like he he lists, I think it's that. I certainly can't do that. Thinking about why it is that I prefer songs like You Can't Do That, and oh my god, my memory's just gone. What's track two? Side one. I really, really like
Track 2, side 1 is I Should Have Known Better.
that song, just can't remember its name. And I think it's because they feel like modern songs, whereas one of the reasons why I'm slightly hard on some of the songs from time to time is that you can hear that Lennon in particular trying phrasing, trying shifts in chords and jumps in melody that you just don't hear anymore. You don't hear them anymore because they don't work. Whereas people will be much more likely to take the melodic structure of something like You Can't Do That, um, and build something around that. Those are the songs that last. However, even experimentations are way more interesting than other bands are doing.
Well, absolutely, and I'll Be Back's a perfect example of that. We may have been not in our best place when we recorded our episode on that particular song, but yeah, you don't get songs which are structured like that. That's just not a thing. And whilst it's not the strongest song on the album, at least it's interesting. At least it's managing to do something which is unconventional, and which you can find something to say about it. It's not just like straightforward pop. And I think it is worth sort of lingering on just how much Lennon's influence hangs over this, because it is just Lennon's album. And we'll come back to this once we start talking about the movie and the way that he's kind of positioned in the film. But it's an astonishing thing just how strong his personality is. And I think going back and listening to this as an album rather than as a series of individual tracks, this is also the first album that I really feel. We'll talk about this a lot when we get to my favorite Beatles album, but spoilers. But we have an album here which I think really is more than the sum of its part. The whole is more than the sum of its part. Listening to the individual songs, there's a few, like looking back at the rankings we've given, there's a few which I like listening to them as songs. I thought, yeah, okay, that's fair. But then going back and listening to them as part of the album, and I thought, wow, I really underestimated how good that song is. Like When I Get Home is a perfect example. I really, really love that song. I gave it, I think, like 5.5. It's like, what the hell was I thinking? But it's hearing it in between things we said today, and You Can't Do That, and again, context as always is everything. But its charms and its skills come across much more clearly. And with like things we said today, we have this very sort of muted kind of vocal from McCartney. It's a thoughtful song. It's a little bit more sort of considered. And then you've got kind of Lennon kind of screeching in with this kind of When I Get Home, and it's just great. His voice sounds amazing on. I love Lennon's vocal on that song so much more than I did when we were just like doing it as a straight song. And then it cuts out to the rather more sinister You Can't Do That, and just having everything placed that way makes it come alive. It is more than the sum of its parts, this album, and that both applies to the B-sides, the soundtrack side, and the album as a whole. It's a really remarkable thing, and so much of that is Lennon. It's Lennon's presence on this album, which is providing that sort of coherent force that pulls it all together.
So I wonder then how much a shift in the way that the tracks were organised, perhaps, makes a difference, because obviously we've moved away from the George Martin structuring of the album onto something that is influenced by elsewhere. We've also moved away from the big closing track, the pacing that Martin was insistent on elsewhere, that you start with a bang, you end with a bang. You can sort of hide some less good tracks just before the end, but as long as you go out with something that's really kind of powerful and uplifting, difference, because you don't have that sort of force towards the end of the sides on this. You've got something that is in places a little bit more subtle, but obviously in the fact that the record company, I suppose Dick Lester as well, wanted the side one to be all the songs from the film.
I think it does make a difference. I mean, sequencing is such an art, and I know we've talked about it in previous episodes, but it is such an art. And even if you take that first side, so you've got Hard Day's Night, Should Have Known Better, If I Fell, Happy Just to Dance with You, And I Love Her, Tell Me Why, Can't Buy Me Love. Fine. You still need to be able to organize those songs into some sort of I'm going to use the word coherent again. You feel free to add that to your bingo card. Some kind of coherent pattern, and being able to segue with those, like the 1-2 opener, A Hard Day's Night, and I Should Have Known Better. That's a really good, strong punch you've got there. Then you pull it back with a little bit more sort of thought, a little bit more consideration with If I Fell. Happy Just to Dance with You. Okay, it's pretty lightweight, but it's kind of fine. It's a little bit fun. It's starting to pick things up again. Then you get kind of the sentimentality, you get the ballad with And I Love Her, before you return to kind of the much more kind of exciting dynamic of Tell Me Why. So there is a proper through line, even if they are just all the songs from the movie. Maybe the word just is not appropriate there, but even if they are the songs from the movie, the soundtrack half of the album, they've still been put together in a way that gives a sort of emotional through line. It's still taking the listener on a journey. It's not 4 or 5 songs which are all rockers and then a couple of ballads stuck at the end. There's real consideration being given to how those songs are laid out and how you will be listening to them as you go through them. I mean, again, I mentioned earlier, like the weakest is I'm Happy Just to Dance with You, but in between like the 2 ballads, If I Fell and I Love Her, that's fine. It provides a little bit of light relief. It provides a little bit of space so that you don't get too kind of drawn into the more romanticized side. If you want to be less kind, the more schmaltzy side. And so the song is still fulfilling some kind of purpose, even if it's clearly the weakest one, from that batch. So yeah, I still think even with the division of soundtrack songs and non-soundtrack songs, the sequencing of it really works well, and real consideration has been given to it. And like talking about the getting away from the George Martin thing of end with a bang, instead we end with a slightly more questioning, slightly more melancholic I'll Be Back. That kind of works as well, because getting away from a formula which has been established in the previous 2 albums gives this album the feeling that it's going somewhere, like it's trying something different. It's not just trying to replicate a formula. And again, that's very much to A Hard Day's Night's advantage. It's another reason why this feels like it's a proper Beatles album, and in the gap between the last 2 feels wider. It's taking a chance. It's not just going to follow what we did before just for the sake of it working.
So, okay, I've got a bit of a hypothetical question for you.
Lovely.
There's no Starkey lead vocal on this album. Looking down the track listing, which do you think would have suited his voice the best?
Wow, now that is a good hypothetical, isn't it? Well, no. I'll Cry Instead. I reckon that's the one I'd go for.
Country twang.
Yeah, and I can imagine a slightly, like, particularly that I've got a chip on my shoulder that's bigger than my feet. That kind of slightly doleful. That sounds like a sort of Ringoism that he could easily carry off. Yeah, I reckon I'll Cry Instead.
I'll Cry Instead was the one that was originally slated to be the You Can't Do We Love sequence, wasn't it?
Yeah,
I think yeah. No, I think that makes sense, because it's one that goes down. Ringo's better at hitting some of the lower notes than he is at hitting some of the higher notes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I can see that. But not having Ringo singing on the album does also give it a slightly different feel that kind of works. Sometimes Ringo's vocals can be a little bit. Here's the intermission, folks. You can, if you wish to, completely tune out of this song. Which obviously is not necessarily a criticism, because as anyone who's been with us for more than about 3 episodes will know, we both like boys, and interpret that remark exactly how you wish. It's
Yeah,
one of
well,
it,
or not.
I, or not. Yeah, it's one of those I think hugely underrated Beatles songs, and I now said that I prefer that to Twist and Shout, for example. It's not to say that Twist and Shout is a bad song. I just happen to think that Boys would have been a better album closer. But there you go. I know I'm in such a yeah, but there you go. So it makes it different, and obviously we'll make up for that on the next album, where Ringo will get his shots at greatness. And in fact, even on the next EP, will have his special moment.
He sure will. Yeah, it is interesting that he doesn't have like a vocal on this, especially given that one of the most praised sequences in the movie is one featuring him. I, I like you know, I enjoy a Ringo song when it's in the right place, and you know, I love Boys. But there is a sense that I think this album is probably better for not having one. I think if it was I'll Cry Instead, just for the sake of argument, I think that would be fine. I don't think it would derail the album or anything. But there is a sense that it's not something that this album greatly requires, and that's fine. It's not in any way an insult towards Ringo. And you know, we've got, you know, we're only a couple of albums away from Act Naturally, so you know, there's that. Yeah, I don't know. And yeah, Ringo does really great work
Yeah,
on this album as a musician. Like Anytime at All, and that snap of the snare before we get started is just such a powerful moment. Like he may not have a vocal, but his presence is all over this album. So even if he's not up at the microphone, he's certainly not simply discarded. He's a really significant part of why all this works. And I mean, I always praise Ringo, of course I do. But here particularly, I think this is also the first album where we have a sense that he is as good at what he does as what maybe he's as good a drummer as George Harrison is a guitarist, or as Paul McCartney is a songwriter, or whatever. He really comes into his own, and his contributions across this are just phenomenal.
what we've started to hit on a few more links between the album and not least then talking about the way in which you can hear a lot more of those individual personalities coming across album, and some of them are in almost unexpected places. George, the best example for me is on "And I Love Her." I think his guitar playing on that is absolutely fantastic, and it elevates what's an incredibly mature and interesting song, bearing in mind how early they are in their career, into something that's almost, you know, exquisite. For example, you know, and the fact that Paul is able to write a song like that as well is particularly fun. You can see his character and his personality coming out there, along with things we said today as well. You know, and obviously John's slightly, you know, caustic, acerbic personality is coming across a lot more in some of his lyrics, even sort of forgetting the extremes of "you can't do that," for example. You know, so it's good to think those individual distinct personalities coming across on the album, because of course they are by design present in the film itself. So at this point, it might be worth just asking the question: do you have you want to mention about the album? Is it worth diving into the fact that, you know, in America they released a soundtrack version that included some of the incidental music? You know, I'm not really that interested in some of the pieces, to be perfectly honest, and I think the incidental music doesn't really help a huge amount. You know, kind of feel sorry that they didn't get the album as it was intended to be. Anything else you want to bring up?
No, not particularly. I mean, I think it is worth noting in passing about the instrumental stuff being stuck out in America, but we've done that now, so I'm quite happy with that. It's not I don't even want to say like it's not interesting. It is interesting, but without having, I mean, it's not something I have any kind of personal history with or anything that I can really speak to. You know, that's fine, but I think it's something that would be more interesting to discuss with somebody who actually like had those albums or has spent time listening to them in that context rather than simply as the album. So yeah, it's interesting that they're there, but that's kind of all it is.
Okay. So at this point, we've been going about minutes. Oh, 40 minutes, blimey. So maybe it's time to delve into the album. And at this point, I'm just going to take a deep breath here. Okay, so it may well be that we could have split this into two episodes. You won't know until you hear it, folks. In fact, you may not even hear this part. At my deep breath, we may have taken a decision to wrap that one up and put something else out. That's fine. It is worth now diving into the cultural phenomenon that is A Hard Day's Night, and I think it's another one of those elements that is like a conjunction of several different things, almost of things that have gone before it. And at this point, it's worth me bringing in the fact that a couple of weeks ago, I'd sort of been out of hospital for a couple of days. On Saturday afternoon, I think we were probably meant to record, but I'd put it off because I still wasn't feeling at all well. And I watched an absolutely hilariously bad film on, I think, BBC Two, and it was the gorgeously awful 1961 Elvis film, A Blue Hawaii.
Oh, you poor thing! As if you weren't
Now,
feeling bad enough.
I know, but it's that reminder, isn't it, that these films, pop stars, didn't start with the Beatles. I'm sure most people out there listening to us will sort of know that already. I mean, in fairness, they didn't really start with Elvis either. I mean, you could go back to, things starring, for example. I'm sure as long as there have been talking pictures, there have been films in which popular stars of the day have also sung things that then were released as, say, sheet music or gramophone records, or whatever format was available. But 1961, we've got Elvis, in a really odd. It is a really. I mean, I could spend ages talking about this film. Such is its oddness. Maybe that's a bonus podcast. His mother's played by Angela Lansbury, for goodness sake. And what's really interesting, but this is 1961. 1962, she was playing the mother of Lawrence Harvey in the amazing Manchurian Candidate that also stars Frank Sinatra. So interestingly, within a year, I don't think she had with Sinatra, but to be in films with Elvis and Sinatra that close together. Of course, Sinatra doesn't sing in that, but there was okay. So it's an odd film in particular. One of the things that I think is in huge contrast to A Hard Day's Night is that the producers seem to have wanted to put Elvis into a film where very basically lots of women find him very attractive and want to be with him. Plot. Whereas, yes, that does happen in A Hard Day's Night. And obviously you have girls who are screaming their heads off, and you have female characters who are very interested in them, but it's a major plot device. But there's one scene in particular where there's a party, and Elvis and the band sing Rocker Hula, the way she moves her hips. It's a great song. And after they've played, she asks her husband, she said, well, what was that? And he answers, something we're going to have to get used to, the sound of youth. And it's like, oh dear God, the producers thought in 1961 that rocker was the sound of youth, and just think how close we are then to modern pop music. really taking over. And actually, what you do get with A Hard Day's Night is the actual sound of to what producers think is the sound of youth. And it's a massive difference. It's a really, really important difference. And this is jukebox Elvis. And actually some of the songs, but I think Can't Help Falling in Love is on the soundtrack to this, for example. And Rockahula's a lot of fun, but it's not essential. And I think that's an important difference as well. And of course, are the other modern variants of this around this time as well. Let's all sort of give a shout out to Mr. Cliff Richard and his
very
films.
very much lingering on the tip of my tongue at the moment.
Yeah, but I think there are other things to bear in mind. So that's clearly an influence. But the British film industry at this point, and although this is funded by United Artists in America, it is in style. Oh, and also it's got, but apart from having an American director and American funding, it is quintessentially a British film. And I think that's particularly interesting because if you bear in mind that a lot of British cinema at this point were, like, let's see, what was I thinking? There's horror films, you've got carry-ons, you've got war films. It's sort of a little bit of a weird collection. But then you've also had over the previous few years, sometimes referred to as new wave or kitchen sink dramas as well, that have they mentioned earlier, the likes of Lawrence Harvey, that he's made his name with before then going off to America to be a big star. Quite interesting that actually what you get is that you get elements of all of this. I mean, partly it's kind of like a revolt against some of those war films. It's kind of an extension of the reality of some of the, because despite the fact it is basically absurd in places, there is an element that it's showing the lives of people that you wouldn't normally have seen on the screen. And there's some humor in here that is a million miles away from carry-ons, for example. So it kind of pulls together an awful lot of other elements of British cinema, which I think is particularly interesting, and not least because, and don't worry, I'll take a breath in a moment. What we've also got is, I think I've called him both Richard and Dick Lester at various points, but at various points in his career, he was either called Dick or Richard. At this point, he is Dick Lester directing this, who is this American who found the American TV and film industry a bit too straight-laced and boring, and made the leap over to the UK, where quite quickly he seemed to get involved in some fairly bits of humour that do then mutate into the kind of humour that we get in this. And there are two examples that it's worth mentioning, albeit one rated and the other is off overlooked. And the venerated one is the thing that he produced with principally Peter Sellers, but obviously there were also other significant people involved, which is the Running, Jumping and Standing Still film, which is the minutes of how could you put it,
dicking about the countryside for no readily apparent reason, basically.
And I kind of feel the same way about that as I do now feel about the Goon Show, in the it was funny once, but stripped of its context, it just looks like it's completely out of step with everything else. And I'm sure lots of people like it. In fact, you can see links to Spike Milligan's humor in some of those series of Q that I remember being repeated 20 or so years ago, as there was another attempt to place Spike Milligan back in the pantheon. And his influence is huge on British comedy, and deservedly so. But I think if you look at some of those individual pieces, you sort of think, I'm not really quite sure why that one, needs to have the importance that it does. And the other one is one that I know I've mentioned before, but I think it's really spending a little bit of time talking about it, and that's It's Trad Dad, which Dick Lester directed in 1962. So before I get stuck into that, do you have anything more to add on the risible running, jumping, standing still film?
Only that it's remarkable how bad it is. It's not funny. There's like one or two amusing sight gags. There's the guy that places like the record on a tree stump and then he runs round it to get the music out of it. That's
Yeah.
a mildly amusing sight gag. But things like the tent gags in it, like they'll be turning up in Magical Mystery Tour like 5 years later. I'm sorry,
Oh, influence,
8 years later.
influence.
Yes, but better. And it's interesting to see in the way that you can start to see the emergence of that kind of absurdist sense of humor, but
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily make it worth all that much in and of itself. If you can, like you were talking about music films, there's a year between Cliff Richard's Summer Holiday and the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night. Summer Holiday 63, Hard Day's Night is 64. The gulf could not be wider. And again, I'm not really saying that to be insulting towards Cliff, but rather, although I'm perfectly fine doing that as well, but rather just to show how there was this kind of divergence. So running, jumping, standing still is 59. And a lot of that kind of absurdist humor is kind of present, if not necessarily always to the foreground in A Hard Day's Night. So you can see it in things like the gag with John Lennon in the bath and he's not under the bubbles after all, ha ha ha. Or people running, the running past the train sequence, give us our ball back, mister. There are hints of it there. It suggests that. And of course, we know, of course, that one of the things that the Beatles shared was a love of the Goon Show and Spike Milligan and kind of absurdist senses of humor. Compare and contrast with Summer Holiday, which is none more straight. It's just a simple, straightforward jukebox musical where people have terribly nice middle class adventures in a double decker bus for no readily apparent reason, and there's a couple of hit singles in there. And that's fine. I don't want to suggest that there's anything wrong with that, but you do start to see this dichotomy emerge. And on one side, you have that extremely traditional kind of thing, which is represented by movies like Summer Holiday. You mentioned Carry On, which absolutely falls into that tradition as well, even though it can be a bit saucy, a little bit cheeky or whatever, but it's very safe within that kind of context. And then this other side which starts to emerge. You have the Goons, you have Spike Milligan, and you have this more kind of absurdist thing, which will eventually lead on to Monty Python and Douglas Adams beyond that, and so on and so forth. That's great. But this is the point where that split occurs. The early 60s is exactly the moment that occurs. And unfortunately, more conventional approach will win commercially, if not artistically. A lot of British. This is kind of the point where you can sort of point to British cinema also starting to lose its way a little bit, because you can only produce so many war films. You can only produce so many Carry On films. You can only produce so many kitchen sink dramas, and a lot of those things don't quite evolve into anything. Whereas the absurdist strand of stuff does evolve. It evolves into Python. It evolves into these other things, and it mutates. It doesn't necessarily have to be something which stays in the cinema. And it's that development. It's the fact that these are art forms which can develop that marks them as significant. Whereas these other ones, they're very staid, they're very small C conservative, and they just don't lead to anything.
Though is a change in the way that war films were being produced. So they're sort of a little less gritty. They're a little less about individual stories, and there's a different way that the Germans are being represented now than some of those post-war films as well. There's sort of a little bit of distance to so telling grander narratives. So it's quite interesting. But what you also got 64, and this is important because I think John Higgs has only recently released a book connections between Bond and the Beatles, because Please Please Me was released on the same day that Dr. No was released. But in 1964, you've got Goldfinger as well. So you've got different things coming into that British film industry. And the industry just get lost in many ways in the 60s and the 70s. But there's still some sort of thriving elements of it. But actually what you do get is a lot of easy choices being made about converting TV programs into films, for example, about things that seem to be big box office, and therefore what you get, I think, successful band, let's put them in a film. So Jerry and the Pacemakers end up having a film. Dave Clark 5 have a film. Not seen it, but I hear it's quite interesting. And that's also where I think it's worth. Oh, by the way, do you want to know what links like Goldfinger and Douglas Adams?
Of course I do.
Richard Vernon.
Oh,
Richard Vernon's in Goldfinger, Hard Day's Night, and Slightly Barfast.
Yeah.
In the TV series as well.
Brilliant.
So there you go. So there's a. Have you seen It's Trad Dad?
I've seen excerpts from it. I haven't watched the entire thing all the way through, I must be honest.
Because I think I really like it. Because it's rubbish. It is. Rubbish.
Yeah.
Because it's inventive, and it's inventive in two ways. So this was, 1962. Richard Lester done some TV work, moving into films, but there are some real comic flashes that are from the running, jumping, standing still film into things that followed. It's the first. It may well be that there are other places where it existed, but it's the first time I've ever seen that gag that you sometimes see in cartoons behind the actors. In this case, it's a singer whose name I've forgotten, and Helen Shapiro. And they're sort of, we need to get to the BBC. Oh, how can we get there quite quickly? And what you then see is the film, roll of film appearing behind them, and then in conjunction with the narrator, Derek Geiler, they then effectively change the reel, and behind them, instead of it being the cafe that they were in, then now actually shows the behind. And it's a really clever, inventive piece of cinema. And maybe that was the first time it was done, or maybe they were nicking up somebody else. But it really, really works. In the scene in the coffee, it's a very high-tech coffee machine that someone the barista is using in order to make coffee, and presses all the buttons and steam comes out. And eventually he just goes over to a little cabinet, opens the cabinet, pulls out a teapot, and pours the coffee from the teapot and hands it over to the customer. It's really, really good. You have the pompous mayor who, when leaving the council offices to go out to his car, I think it's a Daimler, that they stand and watch as the driver runs a flag up the flagpole on the car, gets in the car, drives 2 seconds down the road, gets out of the car, and then as he gets out, they have to wait for the driver to then take the flag back down the flagpole. There's lots of stuff like that's really fun and creative, and frankly quite funny. There's a lot of stuff that isn't, but flashes like that, you can see, right, there is development, there is that progress there. And it's also incredibly inventive. And if you watch, there's a lot of, basically, it's a 70 or 80 minute film, of which I would say about 60 minutes is musical performance. There's so little plot. It is the epitome of the let's put on the show right here, that'll win them over kind of film. But you've got Gene Vincent being framed by the instruments, obviously instruments in the foreground, and you're seeing him through the instruments. You've got the Brook Brothers on an incredibly white set, very sort of crystal clear white, and there's them behind, and the range of angle of shots then are very reminiscent of the performance that the Beatles put on in A Hard Day's Night. You've also then got the Temperance Seven sitting in a line of what looks like office chairs with black, white background and a white piano. And it's so interesting that you can see the link between those performances and the way in which A Hard Day's Night was shot as well. I mean, it's objectively an awful film. It trades on the generational differences, which again is something that crops up in A Hard Day's Night. you've got the olds and the kids, but you've also got the Pete Murrays of the world, the old DJs, like they should be with the olds, but are trying to be with the kids. But it's a lot of it is basically about jazz and the coffee shop, and it feels incredibly dated, but yet there's still enough in there for it to feel like it has an influence over A Hard Day's Night. So, it is available to watch on YouTube. You can watch the whole thing. If you like, you can skip through an awful lot of the performances just to get to where the gags occur. In particular, when they get to something called the Clink Club, the Del Shannon is shot mostly in close up, which is really odd. So you can see his sweat and his very odd shaped head, which perhaps is rather unfortunate. But it's interesting, and I think it's a forgotten piece. The fact that it's only really on YouTube sort of suggests that. So this is the last time I'm going to talk about It's Trad Dad, folks. But it's worth it. And there are a couple of other points that are worth noticing. Obviously, Derek Geiler as the narrator, he crops up in Hard Day's Night. You've got lots of very familiar British comedy names from, say, the 60s and the 70s, and to an extent into perhaps the early 80s. You've got Hugh Lloyd that people will recognise from an awful lot of Hancock episodes, for example. Arthur Mullard, Frank Thornton is in there, brief director. People will know from Are You Being Served, for example. And unfortunately, in my notes, I've written Derek Dimmo, which is very unfortunate. Derek Nimmo, who plays a waiter with lots of interesting side gags in a jazz club. And you'll get that as well in A Hard Day's Night. You have to look, but there's an awful lot of names in there who had a little influence before, but a lot of influence after in British. And my last thing on It's Trad Dad is that it was written by, I will get the pronunciation incorrect, I'm sure, Milton Subotsky. Does that name ring any bells with you?
Yes, I vaguely recognise it.
Do you know from where you vaguely recognise it?
No, annoyingly.
Okay, so I did trail before the episode with my good friend JG that there would be a Doctor Who connection. Milton Subotsky is the man Amicus Productions, who mostly made cheapo horror films, but also he is responsible. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There you go. It's the company that produced the two Peter Cushing Doctor Who films, which he
adapted the original. But yeah, of course. Okay, I couldn't let that one slip past. But yeah, he adapted the Terry Nation scripts for the Daleks and Dalek's Vision of Earth. Yeah.
So about the film, and the one thing that we haven't really done yet is talk about the film.
We should probably do that then, right?
Well, especially as we're now an hour in.
Okay, well, let's talk about the film then. Quite good, isn't it? I think it's kind of interesting in the way that it's sort of parsed out, because there's a real sense in which this film exists for the musical numbers, and the plot elements are kind of the washing line that hangs between the poles of the music numbers, and yet also just manage to function so well on their own too. It's a curious choice, but it works incredibly well. And I do really, really like this film. I'm not 100% in love with it in the way that some people are, but there is so much about this which needs to be commended, and which is so worthy of praise. And it's almost kind of hard to know where to begin with it. I'm going to start with a slight negative, which is also going back to the running, jumping, standing still. There are a couple of moments in this where you thought, this is just no, this doesn't work. You've gone on too long, or it's not quite landed. The overall feeling of the film has, so the overall momentum of the film has such feeling behind it that it almost always overcomes those moments. But there are certain moments in it where you just think, no, I see what you're trying to do there, but this isn't funny. And
Yeah,
that's probably one of the few negative things I'll have to say.
no, that's fine. I mean, I understand they break out of the studios,
Mm.
but I mean, I'm not enamored with the let's run around the playing
Oh
fields
yeah, it's rubbish.
element, and you know the very very about laying down your jacket for a woman over the puddle, and
Mm.
turns out that maybe it's not a puddle kind of thing. It's a little bit on the laboured side as well, but um, I think it's interesting you referring whether or not it's a film in which basically you string out the songs and then you have bits that go in between. Bearing in mind that there are 7 songs on the soundtrack, incidental bits of music, and I Want to Be Your Man, and what's the big hit they play at the end as well? Anyway, the big one. Anyway, in the musical performance, it doesn't matter. We're an hour and 10 minutes in, and no one's actually going to be listening at this stage to go, but they don't actually know what they're talking about. But the one thing that I to an extent disagree. I mean, it's not like it's Trad Dad, where that exists purely to put a whole bunch of but although most of them were on their way out in terms of popularity, artists on film for people to go and pay to watch in a different format. There's in Steve Matteo's excellent book, The Beatles on Film, Act Naturally. He includes a review from Andrew Saris in The Village Voice, who calls it the Citizen Kane of jukebox musicals. Well, I'm assuming it doesn't say. I mean, it suggests that it's a contemporary review. It's interesting that jukebox musical, a term that could have been around as long ago as 1964, but I don't think of it as a jukebox musical in that sense,
No, well,
because there
we
is,
tend to think of things like the Queen musical falls into that
yeah,
category, or Runrig have just done one for reasons. But that tends to be the context we think of it contemporaneously.
yeah, but I think there is a reason for the film to exist is beyond the songs.
Oh
So the
yeah,
songs are an
definitely.
important part of it, but it's a film about being young and successful. It's a film about the zeitgeist. It's a film about what it means on a culture that has been staid and boring and oppressive, restrictive for such a long period of time. It's a film about growing up in that post-war period and then suddenly having something gloriously exciting to grab hold of. And I think the film captures that incredibly well, not least because actually, as we were sort of alluded to earlier, it was personality. And rather than creating personalities for them, very sensibly, the decision was taken in the script to build it around an exaggerated aspect of their individual personalities, who come across as individuals, but within a group. They come across as young people who what they do, but want to keep elements of their personality going as well. And I think that interesting piece on its own. Obviously, take the songs out and it's a 45-minute piece, but I think it works within the context of the times. And in particular, in a way that if you did it about an invented band, it wouldn't work because those inventive bands are never quite as strong if the songs don't work. So there's something about this that I think just really, really works. I know there's some suggestion that there's an awful lot of improvisation, but what Richard Lester at the BFI, he talks about the fact that the script was there, and the funny stuff in the script is on the screen. But there were times when they allowed the Beatles to improvise, that they were good at. So the press conference, for example, is predominantly improvised because those were the interactions in which we know the Beatles were quite funny. Are you a mod or a rocker? No, I'm a mocker. You know, that allows them to be there. But you get a script that's based on who they are that really sort of gives you a sense of just how important they were to the young people of the time, and also how much that annoyed some of the at the time as well. And I think that's just fabulously effective.
Yeah, and I think the positioning of each member of the group as well is kind of playing up to a stereotype of them that already existed, but which is, like you said, it's that writ large. But that's effective because it doesn't really require them to do much more than sort of be themselves and lark around. And like, particularly, like John Lennon is very clearly posited as the leader of the group. We constant comments, oh, that Lennon, he'll be the death of me, and that Lennon, oh, I bet he's responsible for all this, that, and the other. And there's a real sense in which Lennon is being positioned front and center. But even with that positioning, it never feels like it's being done to the detriment of the other three, and that's really significant as well because it helps to reinforce that, well, they're kind of all in it together sort of thing. And again, it's so easy to fall back and kind of like the lazy cliches of talking about the Beatles, and it's terribly difficult that we resist. It's terribly important that we resist that. It's terribly difficult to avoid falling into those traps. But by exaggerating those kind of personality traits as well, it also means that it doesn't require too much in terms of acting, and I think overall that's probably a good thing. Bless him, I love George ever so much, but he wasn't made to be in front of the camera. I think handmade films was a much better place for him to end up in the end. And yeah, he's still fun to watch. He's still entertaining as himself. But yeah, that idea of that very kind of careful positioning, playing up against like stereotypes of the band as they already were, and then just kind of putting them into situations where that could work effectively for them. It does work. Yeah, not every single thing is 100% successful, but that's fine. And here we go. I'm sorry. Please feel free to take your bingo card. The joie de vivre of the film is kind of irrepressible. It's just so hard to escape what a pleasure it is. And okay, there's the odd langueur, or there's the odd moment which doesn't necessarily strike home, but at the heart of it all, the sheer excitement. You used the word excitement, and I think actually that's exactly the correct word. And again, especially if you're comparing it to these like other like movies which musicians have put together at that point. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them are mediocre. I'll let you position its trad dad on that spectrum yourself. But again, if you can again to bring up Summer Holiday, it's generally regarded as Cliff's best movie. It's nice. It's a nice film, but at no point is it ever exciting. Like those post-army Elvis films, none of them are exciting. And that's fine because they're mostly just product. They're being, it's the make a film, make a quick buck, move on to the next musical trend. There's no sense that there's any permanence to this. And that's the other thing about A Hard Day's Night, which I think marks it out as so different from those jukebox musicals which had come before. There's a sense of permanence about it. And not just because it has a historical legacy that now stretches from, well, we're 2023 when we're recording this, from 1964 to 2023, but there's something far more fundamental about it, and fundamental about the way that it's approached and what it's portraying, than here's a nice little jaunt, or here's some pretty scenery and some attractive girls. There's simply more to it. And some of that is coming from what we talked about before, like that absurdist sense of humor. That isn't something that you get in any kind of jukebox musical up to this point. It marks it out as something different. It marks it out as something which is going to be a much more significant contributor to kind of popular culture. And that development is part of what makes A Hard Day's Night exciting, even at this historical distance, even with all the context that we can throw at it. It keeps that feeling of excitement. No other jukebox musical up to this point has managed that. You could, I think, possibly even argue that no other one ever will, or at least not to the same extent. But certainly up to this point, it's the first one, and it's a real landmark for that.
So, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that that George's performances were very good, because that actually goes against some of the things that I think Dick Lester himself said. He thought that that George was I suppose, not, but he thought that George gave really good performances because, actually, I suppose he said he tried the least, as it were. And I'm not sure if it's in the Steve Matteo book or if it's from elsewhere, maybe some of these interviews with Dick Lester. There's a suggestion that because McCartney was living with Jane Asher and was effectively around a theatrical types, that he was aware of things and was trying just a bit too hard, not to be natural, but to be actorly. And so I've seen the insinuation that therefore that's why his individual scene was cut, whereas the others all get more substantial individual moments in the film. I think comes across as quite laid back, and I certainly would agree that he's no Peter Tork when it comes to acting. If you want to interpret that how you like, but perfectly fine. I mean, Ringo comes across pretty well, and maybe that's why people were less worried about him having a song on the album, because there is a bit more focus on him than on his disappearance is much more of a plot point than anything else, and that's fine. But I think they're fine. They're effective enough. I don't think it's a film that requires them a lot of acting. And whenever I sort of think of Lennon in this film, I think of him in a remarkably similar way to quite a well-known clip of them appearing on the Morecambe and Wise show, where he's trying to keep up in terms of the humour, but he's just having a good time. And I think that's the thing that does come across. They're all having a good time, and that seems to be particularly effective here. But I think it's thinking about that they on the film, but I think it's also worth just remembering that there were all these incredibly creative people who allowed them to be seen at their best, and that maybe investment in the cinematography and the staging, the casting, and all of those other things is such a crucial thing in terms of making sure that what we've got here is something that's a little bit different from the show on right here type film, or let's all go away on a bus and travel around Europe kind of thing. You get something that's gritty, that is despite that grit has stark contrast, that allows you to see these people at their best, especially when they're doing things like performing, because they form a contrast to, say, Victor Spinetti's over the top and exaggeratedly anxious.
I love Victor Spinetti in this movie. He's so great.
He is magnificent, yeah. But it's a bit like you've got him, you've got Richard Vernon on the train, you've got Wilfrid Bramble as the clean old man. It's the contrast of the black and the white in the performances. It's the contrast between the older characters and the younger characters that makes such an enormous difference in the film, and really helps them to stand out. It's it's how quickly it was conceived and put together and filmed and then edited and released. We're talking about October, November '63 when the idea was originally floated. We're talking like a month's worth of, with some recording before, some recording after, recording of Hard Day's Night actually during in April '64. It's a phenomenal piece of work. And yeah, there are some loose ends. Yeah, there are some slightly dodgy bits. A massive amount of plot, but just enough. But it is incredibly inventive, not product, but as a piece of cinema. And that's why it regularly hits things like, top 100 best British films or something along those lines. That's why it's still incredibly well regarded to this day.
Well, absolutely, and I think it's also worth mentioning, since you mentioned Wilfred Bramble, you were also talking about the sort of like the slightly more gritty elements of it. There's something really startling about the sequence in the police cell, or so the police station, where he starts singing Irish liberation songs, and watch out for a British Bobby, because they'll kick the shit out of you basically if you're Irish. Like, that's incredibly pointed for 1963, or sorry, 1964, in what is essentially, a quickie cash in. We know that's not what the reputation of the film will end up being, but that's still how a lot of it was conceived. And yet it's got a lot of that kind of police station stuff. Like, that goes on a bit too long. But yeah, in the middle of it, you've got this incredibly like pointed thing about the Irish Free State, and the way that the British treat Irish these days, and it's such a, I don't want to say like it's a weird contrast. It's not. It kind of feels very in keeping with the rest of the movie, but it's just kind of there. It's this kind of sudden injection of social realism into a movie which has mostly been about Ringo putting his coat over a hole so a woman can fall down it. It's a very stark contrast, and yet it works. And part of why it works, of course, is Wilfred Bramble himself. He's able to suddenly do that switch from being kind of charming to kind of being sort of manipulative earlier on in the film. But here we get to see another side of his performance come out, and that sudden anger and that sudden, it's a great little piece of performance. Not one that I think gets particularly hailed or gets much focus, but I really want to point it out because I think he does so well there.
And yet the actual chase to and from the police station and so on and so forth, probably you could have played yakety sax over the top of it. And,
absolutely, that's why it's so weird.
The same impact.
Yeah. Love a bit yakety sax. No, nothing wrong with that piece of music. But anyway, yeah.
The cultural impact is quite interesting. And again, I know it sort of steers away from the Beatles, but towards the filmmaking. But there's Robert's review of it is quite interesting. So and he talks about the inventiveness of some of the techniques. He says, when a film is strikingly original, its influence shapes so many others that sometimes you can't see in the first one. Godard's jump cuts in Breathless, Soup turned up in every TV ad. Truffaut's freeze frame at the end of the Carcassonne, 400 blows, like I forgot my French there, became a cliche. Richard Lester's innovation had become familiar. He didn't invent the techniques used in A Hard Day's Night, but he brought them together in a grammar so persuasive that he influenced many other films. Today, when we watch TV and see quick-cutting handheld cameras, interviews conducted moving targets, quickly intercut snatches of dialogue and music under documentary action, and all the other trademarks of the modern style, we are looking at the children of A Hard Day's Night. And that is, that's quite, and it's amazing just how inventive Dick Lester was at that stage of his career, and how much he was able to involve some amazing talents in his work. We've mentioned in previous, is it Gilbert Taylor, who was also the cinematographer on Doctor Strangelove, and also the first Star Wars film, for example, as well. So there's incredible things that are going on there. But it is, of course, worth remembering Richard Lester was also the man in later life would go on and be the director of Superman 2 and Superman 3. Oh, he was also involved. I think he did direct the first Superman 2 and Superman 3, and not necessarily the greatest of but everyone's got to go somewhere. By the way, just before we started recording, I saw on Twitter that it's the 43rd anniversary of the release of Superman. And I did have just a quick look then at the Wikipedia page for Superman 2, directed by Richard Lester, written by Mario Puzo. Does that name ring a bell? Should do, because he for Best Adapted Screenplay for The Godfather and Godfather Part 2. And he also wrote Superman 2. So anyone's career can go down the pan, really.
We all have to pay the bills.
Yeah, which almost circle to Now and Then, the upcoming Beatles track, really, doesn't it? It's a mighty long way down rock and roll from Top of the Pops to Drawing the Doll. There's a Billy Bragg reference for you. It's a long, a hard day's night, and You Can't Do That, and Things We Said Today, and I Love Her, and this amazing film, and Ringo Starr's All Star Band, which packs out night in America.
It sure does. It sure does. Well, I think that's probably a perfect place for us to start wrapping things up, and we can move towards scoring. We are not going to give a score for the movie because we've just decided that. But we are going to give a score for the album because that's something that we do. So on you go.
You missed an opportunity for a really sort of crap pun there. So we're not going to give a score for the movie because George Mind's already done it.
Hey!
I don't know. I must admit, until you mentioned it, I'd forgotten that we actually were doing scores for albums. So I've got no idea what I've given the last two.
Would you like me to check for you? Would you like me to check?
Yeah, sure. That'll
All right, hang on. Let me just pull up my ultimate spreadsheet of spreadsheetiness, which is there. Just keep everybody entertained. Just vamp, everyone.
What point do we have to pay the copyright?
I'll edit round any potential charges. Don't worry.
Okay, fair enough.
Right, I've got the numbers. Okay, right, here we go. So you give right, hang on. So you gave Please Please Me 5, and you gave With the Beatles 6.
There you go. Let's continue to show progression. Let's say 7.
7. Okay.
Because we know there's big. There's 7.5, but there's no Ringo singing.
Well, you see, I am going to give it 7.5, even without Ringo singing. So that's fine. Yeah, I don't know. I warmed to this album so much more than I expected to when I came to it. So I'm quite comfortable giving it 7.5. And I think we're done. That's fine. Good. This, I think, is probably going to easily qualify as our longest episode. So well done. Well done, everyone, if you've managed to get to this stage. I'm not sure that we have, but, we've done our best and we've covered it. Should you have any questions about anything we have talked about, or such as why, you can really get a hold of us. You can contact us by email. We are BeatlesStuffology@gmail.com. We're on Twitter @Beatles_ology. You can find more of my blog and writing at www.jgmcquarrie.scot, and you can find more of Andrew's writing at www.stuffology.co.uk. Also, please check out my other podcast, which is Talking Trek to You, where a noob and an alleged expert, moi, go through the original Star Trek episode by episode. Please like, rate, and review us on whatever podcatcher you're using, so that more people can find the show. Next episode, we are going to be doing the Long Tall Sally EP. So we're going to do the whole EP as one episode because 3 of the 4 songs are covers. And yes, I know we should have done it before A Hard Day's Night, but we haven't. So I'm sorry, that's just the level of professionalism you'll have to live with from this podcast. But that's what we're going to be talking next time. So thanks for staying with us this long, if you've stayed with us this long. If you didn't, well, fuck you. But anyway, until then, keep listening.